Hello, Hannah. I will give a short introduction to
Great.
introduce you.
Perfect.
Welcome, everyone. Slowly, more people are dropping in. I will give an introduction, so there's some time for people to drop in. First of all, welcome. I'm Esther Urles. I'm founder and member of the Filmwerkplaats in Rotterdam. We are an artist-run film lab, basically 16 mil. We are an analog, so photochemistry film lab. And we started this photographic garden project as a kind of series of lectures and seminars to research and explore the questions of environmental consciousness around analog or photochemistry filmmaking, and what new artistic potential can be reached from this approach. Working with analog nowadays is, of course, totally based on a kind of do-it-yourself. So it went from an industry medium to really an artist medium, especially 16. And so it also changed the way of how films are made nowadays. So the alchemy-oriented production process is now very important, especially in combination with the do-it-yourself way of working. And the tactility of the film medium is also very important nowadays. And so that's why we started this series of lectures. Every month we will have a lecture this year till November. And today we have a very first lecture, which is alternative image making processes. First, I want to tell you something. We have a few rules on this. The idea is that we will give the lecture, and if you have any questions, you can use the chat and put your questions there, because the idea is that after the lecture, we can do a kind of questions and answers with Hannah. And also the idea is that we record this lecture, but from tomorrow on, we also will try out certain ideas Hannah will give us in our own lab here at the back. That everything we try out, it's really a researching process, that we will make it available online, and others can use it and add extra information, because we are part of a bigger network of artist-run film labs, and we think it's very important to have a kind of openness and open sharing, open access of everything what is happening now, because this shift toward this artist way of working with analog 16 mil, I think it's very important that we share as much as possible. So I'm very happy that Hannah is our first guest, and she will talk about her alternative image making processes. Hannah is a London-based artist working with photographic processes. She's initiator of the Sustainable Darkroom. She's co-director of the London Alternative Photography Collective. And Hannah is a facilitator of sustainability within the arts. Her work intertwines organic matter such as soils, algae, mushrooms, and roots into analog photographic mediums and surfaces. She does this while simultaneously exploring environmentally and ecologically focused issues, working in an investigative, pseudo-scientific and environmentally conscious matter. This lecture will be recorded and later available online. Welcome, Hannah.
Thank you very much. Sorry for jumping in there before you earlier. I wasn't sure if anything had already been said. But yeah, thanks so much for inviting me here. And it's a really great lineup of other practitioners, lots of who I am familiar with and have worked with in the past. I can see Joanna here today, so it's nice to see Joanna and some other familiar faces. And I really look forward to seeing all of the future kind of lectures take place over the next few months. So I'm going to start sharing my screen for you all. I'm not sure how long this is going to end up being. I haven't timed myself doing it, but I'm sure there'll still be plenty of time for questions at the end. So it was quite a nice challenge for me over this week to kind of think about the application of what I would consider photographic processes and methods in a slightly different light, kind of addressing it more from a filmmaking stance, or considering how these methods can be applied across the filmmaking kind of process and way of working. So what do we see when we look at an image? We see the subject of that photograph, a loved one, a memory, a snapshot, and a moment in time. Breaking down the being and the creation of photography and working with the materials to understand them, their characteristic and their performance in relation to how we use them and how we can understand them changes one's viewing of the image. As makers of these images, we no longer just see the fleeting moment, the decisive moment, the content of the frame, but we see the surface, the texture, the material being of that object. And it is an object being simply a material thing that can be seen and touched. Perhaps that is one of the reasons why you and I work with analog processes, because of this objectness, the ability to see and to touch, because after all, it is within our own human desire and our nature to touch and to feel. Touch is fundamental to human communication, to learning and understanding. Through our skin, we sense pressure, temperature, texture, weight, and more. And it's through these senses that we come to understand the world and how it functions. So what does it mean to have this understanding of the world? And what does it mean to be human in a way? In particular, what does it mean to be human today, working with these processes in our current kind of climate? Well, currently we're in a geological epoch called the Anthropocene, or others might call it the Capitalocene. The current geological age viewed as the period during which human activity and capitalism has been the dominant influence on climate and the environment. We have and continue to have a detrimental impact on the planet. As makers, as creators, a lot of us feel an urgency and an energy towards a desire to have and produce a physical response to the ecological crisis. A physical response by doing what we do best, by making, by expressing through creation. But sometimes it can be hard to do this when the very materials we are using as analog photographers and filmmakers are contributing to this very crisis. How, as artists, are we to move forward and navigate such a tangle of interests and societal roles? How can we be one and both at the same time? How can we have agency while maintaining our artistic practice? I know a number of artists who stopped their analog photographic practice altogether. A friend of mine, Eva Sajovic, quit working with photography when confronted with the damaging environmental consequences and the tricky toxic nature of it, and turned her hand to weaving instead. She sees her weaving as a form of photography, and this is how she describes her practice. To deal with my discomfort with material and symbolic qualities of photography, I reverted to weaving. Weaving, like photography, is a binary and time-based medium. A woven piece, like an analog photograph, consists of a surface which provides an aesthetic quality and structure that gives it a functional quality. The loom is a precursor to early computer technology. For example, the analytical engine was based on the loom. It used separate decks of punch cards to make what we call a program. Machine repeated decks of cards to execute a loop, and so weaving was kind of created and exists. I'm just going to play this very short video of her making process called Hanging by a Thread, which is part of her solo exhibition that's currently on at the Bodazar Zajek Art Museum in Slovenia. Oh, if I can play it. Okay, I'm not going to play that for now. So whilst photography relies on the materials of plastic and gelatin, silver and other rare minerals, the choice of weaving materials offers one to be more environmentally friendly. For example, hemp and linen are environmentally friendly materials, easily grown, do not require large quantities of water, pesticides, and are also antiseptic. Hemp can also be used to replenish the soil. Eva then goes on to talk about growing the crops herself to make the yarn and weave into cloth, how this process of revisiting forgotten skills of spinning, weaving, and growing brings us closer to understanding our environment and how our bodies behave when interacting with earthly elements. The fundamental materials of analog photography and film are the same. We have a base, usually made of plastic or celluloid, a light-sensitive emulsion covering that base, made of silver halide crystals. These are then suspended in a substrate that allows the chemicals to access them. This substrate is usually bovine gelatin. These materials are then placed in a contraption that allows light to pass through a lens and expose an image onto that surface. The surface is then developed, fixed, washed, and dried. I read here from Michelle Henning's text, From Surface to Skin, Collodion, Celluloid, and Artificial Nature. Surfaces can be understood as impermeable or permeable, as interfaces, membranes, barriers, or boundaries, or as entities in themselves. Human skin, for example, is understood as a surface separating our body from the world, mediating between inside and out, but also as itself a bodily organ. The photographic surface might be conceived as a kind of sensitive skin, insofar as it is flexible, laminate, semi-permeable, reactive to light and to pollutants in the atmosphere, even though made up of not of living cells, but of crystals. When we think about addressing the thingness of film, we can intervene or interrupt at any stages of the material construction that I just described. Today, that is what I'm encouraging you to do, to disrupt the process, the material, and the traditional thingness of the thing itself. In these disruptions and interruptions, we find new ways of working that bring us closer to understanding our environment and how our bodies behave when interacting with earthly elements. So you are tasked with the challenge to find your own way of disrupting within your own practice, your own way of working. And I'll give you some examples and ideas today, but these are not necessarily relevant to your practice, your environment, or your own creative methodologies. It is essential that as artists, we have the confidence to find our own path of interruption according to the ways we work, the place we work, and the materials we work with. So the first element I'm going to talk about is what I'll call the carrier. This is the element upon which we put our light sensitive emulsion. So traditionally the carrier was made of celluloid film. In photography, it also includes glass plates and paper. but I'll kind of focus more on celluloid because that's more relevant to the practitioners here today. So the invention of celluloid came in the 1800s when several chemists and inventors explored the possibilities of dissolving nitrate cellulose in a mixture of alcohol and ether. The collodion, as this solution was called, was a clear fluid with the consistency of syrup that, when poured out and allowed to dry, resulted in a transparent film. Several applications, such as wound plaster, a means to render fabrics waterproof, and a basis layer for photosensitive materials were successfully developed. George Eastman adopted celluloid for his Kodak film in the late 1800s, while Ilford's flat films were sliced from celluloid blocks supplied from America. Due to celluloid's explosive nature, in the 1930s, film manufacturers introduced safety film with a cellulose triacetate plastic base. Now, since the late 1900s, almost all release prints use polyester film stock. This polyester film stock will last hundreds of years, a brilliant invention and transition for the archivability of film and preservation of cultural history. However, it also begs the question, do we want all of our film to last hundreds of years? Perhaps there's a beauty in things that are fleeting and momentary in their life. Another friend of mine, the artist Alfonso Borregan, created a series of pieces that are just this: objects of latency, of impermanence. He produced a series of ceramic pinhole cameras. Each camera was built from the clay along the very same riverbed that they then went on to photograph. The cameras were then coated with a photosensitive emulsion. So on the screen are some pictures of these ceramic pots, which worked as pinhole cameras. And we can see the kind of these cork stoppers, which essentially were the pinholes themselves. So when they were ready to expose, he removed those cork stoppers and then popped them back in to stop the exposure. So these cameras were coated inside with a light sensitive emulsion, making them a kind of one-time use photographic object. The design of these ceramics is that they are to be thrown into the water. Some float and some sink. As they enter the water, the pinhole is exposed, allowing it to photograph the image and allowing it to photograph the image flow, the river flow, for several minutes. This image remains printed on the inside of the ceramic surface. However, these images are not fixed. Bottled up inside the layer of ceramic, once the pinhole is blocked off, they are safe from light and safe from disappearance. In order to discover this image, the ceramic would have to be broken. In the act of exposing the image captured, you simultaneously lose the image itself. In the very act of seeing, we lose sight. Perhaps it is a good thing if not all of our works last hundreds of years. So to combat this kind of lack of degradability, I've also been researching other materials that could hold potential for kind of a film-based substrate. One of these is the symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast that forms when brewing kombucha, otherwise known as a SCOBY. So kombucha is a fermented drink made from tea and sugar, known for its health benefits. The symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast is a naturally occurring part of the kombucha brewing process. It's constantly renewing itself, and a new layer of SCOBY will grow on the surface of the old one every time you brew a new batch. This makes it a byproduct. Once rinsed and dried, the SCOBY is an incredibly versatile material, some describing it as vegan leather. It can be grown to any dimensions or size that you wish, so long as you have a container which it will can go in. Essentially, it will grow to any size container that you put it in, or any shape. It's also translucent, and I found that chemistries adhere to it very successfully. There is still a lot more research to do, but I think it has great potential for the analog photography and film communities going forward. So far, Alice Kaznav and I have been working with both cyanotype chemistries and silver emulsions on the SCOBY material, and I'm currently working on it at a very large scale. But after this, I hope to research it at a much smaller scale with the thoughts for housing it within the camera. So this is my image of my very large kombucha SCOBY that I've grown so far. It's kind of as big as me, as you can see. And it took quite a lot of chemistry to coat it, and I'm still exposing it. It's been exposing for 2 days so far. It's been really slow. I think it's because it absorbed so much chemistry. But when that's done, I'm sure I'll have some pictures up on my social media or somewhere if anyone wants to follow along the progress of the giant photographic SCOBY. And my Instagram's at the bottom there if anyone's wondering. So there's also the possibility of using paper as the carrier of our film. A company called Washi, an independent producer of analog film, creates handcrafted films on Japanese paper, currently offering orthochromatic film on kozo paper and panchromatic film on gampi paper. These are both Japanese handcrafted paper. They also offer reversal black and white panchromatic paper film. The company's ethos is based on values of innovation, simplicity, and ecology. The adopted processes link it to the maker and DIY movements. Recycling takes an important part in the making of the films and many production tools. Without a desire to become a market leader, Washi in many ways echoes a more sustainable approach, highlighting some possibility for wider adoption by collectives and film labs. Other forms of paper-based imaging steer away from the classic physical dimensions of film. For example, light-sensitive chromatography typically takes a circular formation. Soil chromatography is a beautiful hybrid between ecology, science, and photography. It's a process that I've been teaching for a couple of years now, but only just the other day when writing this lecture did the consideration of using a silver-coated filter paper in the back of a camera cross my mind. So, the process of soil chromatography relies on the use of silver nitrate to create a thin silver film within the fibers of the paper. Much like a photographic slide, film, or paper, this silver film then forms silver hydroxide when our soil solution is coated across the same filter paper. The unstable substance forms precipitates and gives rise to patterns, colours, and formations on the surface of the paper, imaging the components, minerals, and molecules present in that sample of organic matter. This form of image making that does not rely on any plastics, gelatin, no toxic or developer or fixer are needed, and with no washing process involved at all, we're not wasting litres of water per image. What's more, no waste products are created in its production, and it has a very small silver usage. So you could think of this process as a near perfect model of a sustainable photographic image making process. The last alternative idea surrounding a carrier that I'm going to talk about today draws on the historical process of the daguerreotype. Melanie King is currently researching the possibility of using reclaimed silver from her spent photographic fixer to plate a daguerreotype. I've got a short video of her talking further about this, which I hope I'll be able to play.
In this video, we'll be talking about making a daguerreotype. So I've made daguerreotypes before with an artist called Brenton Weth. Brenton is a trained silversmith, and he's trained me on 2 separate occasions to make daguerreotypes, but I've not been able to have the equipment to continue making them. However, today I'm actually going to take the equipment home so that I continue making them for my Origin of Silver project. A daguerreotype is a 19th century type of photographic process. To make the daguerreotype, you get a piece of copper which is coated in silver, and then you expose this to iodine gas. Then you expose this to light and develop it in the sunshine. And then you put in the fix as usual. And this is called the Becquerel daguerreotype process. Historically, daguerreotypes would have been made with mercury. However, I'm not interested in using mercury at all because it's dangerous and it's also probably not very good for the environment. So what I'm going to do is just continue to use the Becquerel process. Iodine gas is a little bit dangerous. It can really affect the lungs. So today we'll be using a fuming cabinet. In previous times, I have been excited about the potential of just exposing the iodine gas outside, but it's not really a controlled environment and it made me a little bit nervous. I'll be taking the fuming cabinet home and I'll actually be able to continue practicing at home. I wouldn't recommend doing this at home without some kind of ventilation. And if you have access to a fuming cupboard, that is preferable. So I'm making daguerreotypes for my Origin of Silver project, which looks at how to recycle silver from Photographic Fixer. So in my previous video, I looked at how to reclaim silver from Photographic Fixer and put this onto a copper plate. Now I have some silver plated copper plates and I'm going to expose them to light. So the idea is that when I have recovered the silver and plated some copper with Fix, I can then make a daguerreotype onto it. So that's the plan. And this is part of my Arts Council England funded project. So a big part of my project is that silver is born in supernova. This is the only way to make silver as it's a high energy process. It also means that any silver that has been formed into our planet is also very rare. So once we've mined all of the silver, we then can't get any more. So it's really important in that sense that we then recycle silver. The daguerreotype in this way is actually potentially quite a sustainable process, and I'll tell you a few reasons why. For example, if you don't like the image, you can just wipe off the image like condensation and then re-expose it to iodine and then re-expose it to light. So there's no metal wastage in that sense. It also uses a very small amount of water, so I'm probably going to be using filtered water to continue this process. And you just need that for a little bit of fixing and a little bit of washing. Because you're working with small plates and a small amount of silver, then it's likely that you won't use very much fixer. And you see today we're using quite small plates. If we were using virgin silver all of the time, that would be unsustainable. But a lot of silver is actually recycled in this country, so that's one good thing about having silver plating done professionally. But I'm going to try even harder to make this more sustainable by using silver from my photographic fixer and then using that to recoat the copper. So now I'm going to show you the footage from when I went to make daguerreotypes with Brent and West.
So the next element of the kind of structure that I'm going to talk about is the light sensitive emulsion. These are the particles that are reactive to light, traditionally formed of silver halide crystals. It can form between the elements silver and one of the halogens. When a silver halide crystal is exposed to light, a sensitivity speck on the surface of the crystal is turned into a small speck of metallic silver. This is what forms the latent image. If this speck of silver contains approximately 4 or more atoms, it is then rendered developable, meaning that it can undergo development, which turns the entire crystal into metallic silver. So that's what we see when we develop our films, papers, or slides. But as Melanie mentions in her video, silver is a limited resource on Earth. It's in short supply and ore grades continue to reduce. I have concerns about the scarcity of silver, and I've been consequently thinking about the possibility of producing photographic images with other metals that also change color when they go through a reduction oxidization reaction. So iron is one of these metals. And iron is the 4th most common element in the Earth's crust and can be fully recycled to produce a new form of the same quality and integrity as the product it has been recycled from, making it a very sustainable element to work with. When iron goes through a reduction oxidization reaction, it produces red rust. These series of works have all been produced incorporating the redox reaction of iron into rust, raising the suggestion that if we want photography to be to kind of have a future, then the future of photography might look quite different to the black and white analog imagery that we now know and have associated with since the 1800s. Perhaps the future of photography will be tones of orange, red, brown, and white. At present, this work exists just as a material exploration rather than a scientific study. But cyanotype chemistry is another light-sensitive photographic emulsion that already exists and has an iron base to it. The combination of UV light and the citrate reduces the iron, followed by a complex reaction of the iron with ferrocyanide. The result of this is an insoluble blue pigment. Mostly, cyanotypes have been used and practiced through contact printing, but can we take this chemistry beyond contact prints? Emily Rose Paris has been researching the capabilities of cyanotype-coated materials to be printed using a camera and lens. Though she's had successful results so far, and we could think about coating a film, say with cyanotype chemistry to expose in camera. Each of these images has taken her a number of days to expose due to the very low light sensitivity of the cyanotype chemistry. So this makes it quite a limited form of image making for in-camera images. My last example of emulsions is even less light sensitive than cyanotype, taking days, weeks, or even months to expose. This is plant, flowers, and fruit juices that can be exposed to make anthotypes. The word anthotype comes from the Greek word anthos, meaning flowers, and a number of plant emulsions are naturally sensitive to light. Over time, they fade with exposure to UV. Anthotypes make use of these natural properties, allowing us to make prints using nothing other than the photosensitive materials of plants found around us, paper and the sunlight and time. The thousands of different plant emulsions we will have various color fastness and the different strength of the sun depending on your season, weather, geographical location will also affect your duration of exposure. Nettie Edwards is an artist who works quite extensively with the anthotype process, and she talks about the process of letting go. Anthotypes are a process that cannot be fixed, and therefore an acceptance of making them is that they will fade. Nettie talks about this, and I'm just going to read out how she talks about kind of accepting this eventual fading of the image. The final part of the anthotype process is letting go. From the very outset, I'm committed myself to accepting this. Making anthotypes is meditative. One might even say spiritual process that strikes a deeply resonant chord within almost everyone who discovers it. Visitors to my workshops and presentations have shared stories about very personal experiences of death and dying, of loss and commemoration. These stories are woven into the fabric of my work, as are environmental issues. The ephemerality of my prints is intrinsic to their materiality and meaning, and of far less concern to me than the damage humans are doing to the beautiful planet. That was the quote that I just read out there. So the next part of our kind of light sensitive layers is the substrate, as I'm going to call it. And the substrate, as I see it, is the substance that binds the light sensitive emulsion to the surface of the film. We do not need this layer with all emulsions. Cyanotypes and anthotypes that I discussed previously bind themselves to their base without the need of any form of substrate to suspend them in. Silver halides, on the other hand, need something that will suspend and hold the crystals while allowing them to be accessed by light, as well as allowing solutions to permeate through the substrate. Gelatin production is part of the meat industry, an intensive animal agricultural system. It helps to fund this industry and keep it profitable. Animal agriculture is responsible for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions. That's more than the combined exhaust from all transportation. Livestock and their byproducts account for at least 32 million tons of carbon dioxide per year. That's 51% of all worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. These are just a couple of the facts associated with animal agriculture. So what alternatives can we explore? We can think about plant-based alternatives such as agar and carrageenan. Both of these are seaweed derivatives. Agar is a jelly-like substance obtained from red algae, and carrageenan is a substance extracted from red and purple seaweeds, consisting of a mixture of polysaccharides. It's used as a thickening or emulsifying agent in a few food products. So Alice Kazanav also experimented with printing in-camera cyanotypes directly onto agar. Currently, this one's still a bit underexposed, but it definitely shows a potential. We can also think about the seaweed directly. So these are Emily Paris's experiments of using in-camera cyanotype emulsion directly onto sea lettuce. So here, she's not only disrupting the substrate, but she's also disrupting the base and the emulsion. She's using a non-silver emulsion on a non-plastic base without the need for any kind of gelatin or any other binding formation. We can also look to other alternative photographic processes to see what these and some more historical processes to see what these might hold in store for us. Gum bichromate printing is a 19th century photographic printing process based on the light sensitivity of dichromates. It traditionally uses potassium dichromate, a very toxic chemical that is acutely and chronically harmful to health. Right, my previous image was actually this is the potassium dichromate. It's very aggressive orange color. So not something you really want to be messing around with. And it's actually banned now in Europe because of its kind of health implications. So as an alternative to this, we can think about using something like diazote, which is a compound already used in screen printing to prepare the sensitized screens. Laura Demoxon tested this out during one of the sustainable darkroom residencies that I ran last year with some promising results. Here are some further kind of details about her research and tests and kind of different sensitizers that she worked with. So first she tried this one called Speedball. She had some issues with it kind of sticking, but you know, she was getting images from it eventually. And then she also trialed with this CAS diazo and found this much more kind of durable and successful. So these were her individual layers, and the way that a gum bichromate print works is that you basically create 3 separate layers. So you make 3 different exposures of different colors. You can also just do one exposure if you say you wanted just a yellow image or just a pink image or just a black image. But if you want to get a multi-colored image and something more representational of like a classic color photograph, then you would expose 3 colors, and they would generally be from like opposite sides of the spectrum. So you might have blue, pink and yellow, like your cyan, magenta. And that gives you a kind of color looking image. So this is her one of her final successful tri-colored prints, so using 3 different layers. She used a cyanotype base instead of using a kind of blue, a cyan base. She chose to do a cyanotype and then layered on top of this yellow and magenta using a mixture of the diazo, and then basically you mix your diazo with just a watercolor pigment that you would buy from an art shop. So though it's not perfect, this kind of shows the potential of using other mediums to introduce color onto surfaces and other ways of creating kind of color imagery. Perhaps this diazo gum process could even be used on film to create a new form of color negative. We can also think about if diazo could be used as an alternative to low toxicity chemical in processes like carbon printing, another process which also used to rely on the highly toxic potassium bicarbonate. I just get everyone to turn their mics off. Thank you. The other thing we could look to in terms of historical processes is albumen printing. Another historical photographic process, this one using egg whites. Traditionally, albumen printing uses the albumen found in egg whites to bind the photographic chemicals to the paper, and that became the dominant form of photography positives from around 1855 up until the start of the 20th century. It was a really widely used technique. But what other things could we bind the silver to the paper other than albumen found in egg whites? Well, yesterday in a symposium I took part in, I was actually asked whether I'd ever tried using slug slime for such purposes. I have not yet, but it's an interesting idea and an example of how we can look to nature and resources which are already around us and perhaps considered nuisances or undesirable, and how we can activate these in ways that might kind of innovate our practice. So Sophie Sherwood experimented using chickpea water to replace the egg whites found in albumen printing during, again, one of the sustainable darkroom residencies that I ran last year. These are her results from her tests. So you can see that she got some kind of sepia tone style images. They look a bit like salt prints or something. It is quite a similar process to salt printing. So just working with the juice straight from a kind of shop bought can of chickpeas. So lastly, I'm going to address the device. And by this, I mean the thing that puts the image onto all of these layers and surfaces. The thing that kind of creates the form that we see as a photograph. Usually this is thought of as a camera, but it could also be nature itself. or it could be constructed using items from the rubbish bin. With society's current lack of culture around kind of fixing and mending our broken objects, cameras are just as much part of the problem as the rest of it all. But we do not always need to buy a new device to make good images. If your understanding of a good image is one that has the highest number of megapixels in it, then maybe you need to change your understanding of what a good image is. Images are all around us, in the leaves that fall on the concrete, to the spores deposited by mushrooms. We can activate nature's ability to provide us with photographic images through the addition of a few low toxicity chemicals, such as in the method of phytograms. A phytogram is a method developed by Carol Dewing. It's a technique that uses the internal chemistry of plants for the creation of images on photographic emulsion. It relies on the same phenols that we rely on to make a plant-based photographic developer, which is coming up in a later lecture. So if you're not already familiar with that, you'll have a lot more knowledge of that in a few months. So if you're not already aware of phytograms and the process, I recommend you checking out some more on Carol's blog, which is just phytogram.blog, and I can put that in the chat. I'll do that now because otherwise I'll forget, Naomi. So, being a filmmaker himself, Carol has animated a number of his works using the process of applying plant matter directly to the surface of 16mm film. Carol has also written a couple of papers around his research on the subject. And I read from a section of his paper, Phytograms, Rebuilding Plant Affiliations. The structural materialist approach questions the cinematic disbelief. Thus, its aim is not to create a near perfect illusion, but instead to create an awareness of film as a system. Through a full grounding of materiality, the audience is made aware of the actual qualities of the medium, such as emulsion, grain, frame lines, splices, pixels, codexes, frequencies, and light beams. Textures, rhythms, patterns, and abstractions can induce subjective experiences that trigger transcendental awareness. So these kind of all explain a direct contact form of image making. They rely on the surface to surface contact of an object, a material, or a being with the photographic or light sensitive surface. But there too exists an example of a non-contact based approach to rethinking our device. And this comes in the simple form of a housing, a construction made from old tins and boxes, tubs and tubes. This is the pinhole camera. The pinhole camera can be seen as a simple light-proof box with a tiny hole instead of a lens, or it can be a collaborative relation of image making between a vegetable, a tree, or a mouth. Unthinking, reinventing, and relearning what opportunities and surroundings might be able to offer us allows new kind of paths to form and new image making processes to develop. So that's the end of my lecture. I covered quite a lot of things, and I wanted to kind of be able to give quite an overview of different ways that we can approach this. And I know that you're having some, much more talks about chemistries and specific processes later on. So that's why I didn't kind of focus on any of that. So yeah, now I'm happy to open the floor to questions. I can stop sharing my screen.
Ik moet mezelf even pinnen. Thank you, Hannah. Very nice. And yes, you're correct. We're going to have much more lectures in this. The next one actually will be silver gelatin emulsion making.
Right.
And then afterwards, we also do developing with plants by Ricardo Leite. And actually, we took the title Photographic Garden from his research about plant-based chemistry. And then we also will do tinting and toning with plants and other materials from nature by Joanne Meyer. I think she's also in the one of the viewers. And then also pioneering to capture an image with light by Mark Osterman. He's from the Eastman Museum in Rochester. And then also regenerating outdated film materials, because at least in our environment, in our lab, we have a lot of outdated materials left. So we also want to work with these. So thank you. And I actually want to start with my own question.
Of course.
If it's okay. And if anyone has a question, please put them in the chat and we can talk about it. Because the idea is also that tomorrow that we will internally here in our own lab start researching the ideas you gave us. And it was very inspiring. But I have some practical questions maybe you can help me with. You're talking about this diazo thing, and we already got some materials for this.
Right.
I hope we got all the materials for this, but I have a very practical question. How are we going to do that?
So the easiest thing is to follow a like a kind of recipe that's been tested a bit. So I can put a link up to that.
Yes.
It's essentially, as I briefly described, it's a process of coating several layers with your pigment paint, and that can be any color that you choose as well. You know, you don't have to go for the traditional cyan, magenta, yellow, and then you just expose each one at a time. But the thing that you have to do is to you don't have to use a negative with it if you don't want to. You can just lay objects on top of it and do like a layering of plants. I might show you an example actually of an artist who works in that way. I'm just going to get the best kind of resource in terms of a recipe for it up first for you, and then I will so that link that I posted really clearly goes through kind of how you would approach doing it, but it does talk about using a negative to expose it. I've never tried, but I'd be really fascinated to see whether you could expose it in camera, say. Obviously the tricky thing about that is there's nothing in your camera that's kind of filtering out the channels to say that color gets exposed with that and that gets exposed with that. It would be a case of having to shoot something like the same scene and leave your camera exactly where it was in with like one color of coating, then kind of washing that off, recoating it with the next color, putting it back in the camera, and then reshooting that scene. So it would be like very experimental, but I got the impression that's what you guys were kind of on the path for.
So basically a very, I see Tuta saying also a very kind of technical color way of three.
Exactly, like a very slow, if you like, way of making a color image, but not using any silver. or any color chemistry. So, you know, you don't develop it at any point, you just wash it. And the areas which haven't been exposed to light, then they wash off. So a bit like when you wash off a cyanotype, the areas that haven't been exposed to light. And, you know, if you can do a cyanotype in camera, then to me, it suggests that you would be able to use this in camera as well. But definitely just start off with doing one color first, because that's much simpler. And then once you kind of get comfortable with that, then think about layering, you know, a second color on top of that, and building up like a multi colored and layered image. I'm just going to show you. Paula Riff is an artist that works with this process, but not using like a negative, using objects instead. And the kind of layering, let me share my screen. So you can see here, the layering of her colors comes from different positionings of the plants that she puts on the materials. So you can really play with, obviously when the different colors combine, they then produce, you know, a new color, like with color theory. When all of your colors combine, then white is produced. So here she's working with a pink, I think it's a yellow, but then the yellow is laid on the blue, so that's what's giving us the green. So she's working with, again, like cyan, magenta, and yellow here she's working with, but she's gotten, you know, other colors arising from that as they kind of cross over at different parts. So your negative in this way, her negative being the fern, doesn't have to be applied in exactly the same position every time. Actually, the movement of it creates a very interesting kind of effect.
And do you think it would be possible to apply this on pieces of 16 or 35 millimeter film without it rinse off while washing?
I think it depends. Like the diazos vary quite widely, but I think you'll just have to try. Like you won't, because I don't know what diazo you're working with, and you know, like there are always so many variables with any new technique you're doing, and it's just a question of like having some fun and experimenting.
Yes, and we will, because the idea is that we will experiment some 2 weeks in our lab, and then make pictures of everything and record it and put it online so everyone can see our stumbling through this stuff going on.
Great. If anyone decides to use the slug idea and harvest some slug slime to make a gelatin, let me know.
Well, there's a question, of course, how to make them possible to get through a camera.
Which part is that?
Well, Joanne is asking that most of the techniques you talked about is probably easy or more practical in a way as you use them as print techniques on film, because film is, of course, besides the camera, you also have non-camera issues as printing and everything, and a lot of we do is about printing. Mm-hmm. So I think most of your techniques will be used as printing techniques. You're also talking.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. About.
I was just going to say. So I mean, yeah, as a practitioner, that is the way that I work. But the way that I kind of tried to structure and tried to think about how these processes could be applied more in the camera was to break down, you know, essentially what a film is and how we can try and readdress like individual aspects of that. Although most of the examples I showed, you know, were more print based, I think there's definitely, though it's maybe harder, I think there's definitely the potential to think about them more in camera. And yeah, I mean, hopefully that kind of came across, but it's definitely a challenge, and it was a challenge for me to kind of try and think about how I would address it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, Joanna thinks it would be fascinating to get a kind of paper structure through a camera in the sense of film. But as I remember good, one of the first tryouts of film were on paper actually. But then you probably have the issue of projection.
The issue of what, sorry?
Projection, that you have a different way of projecting, that it's more like this flip booking, that you have a very fast seeing images with little papers.
Yeah, and I mean the film that's made of paper that I referenced, the washi film, which is made of Japanese papers, the thing about it is it's quite fragile. You can't develop it in the same way that you would develop your normal film, because putting it through a spool kind of risks ripping it. So, you know, then in terms of thinking about that more, if you wanted to project it as a film, you know, I'd imagine the pull of the projector would just, you know, wouldn't be durable, it would rip. So that definitely, you know, I think there's a lot more limitations in a way to film because of maybe the way that it's presented, or because you're not, you know, printing something like in photography. It's more on the kind of projection of the actual material. In a way, you know, you rely a lot more on that material of the film itself than, say, photography does.
Yeah, I think it's very inspiring, because with film you also think always about sustainability in time. Like, film is the most reliable material if you want to archive something. And I really like the idea of that, maybe what artists will going to do in research, that this will disappear. That I'm also I'm making kombucha myself, so I'm a little triggered by your SCOBY thing. But first I wanted to ask us, because you asked us to get some spinach.
Yeah, so spinach is like the fastest, one of the fastest exposing plants for anthotypes. So if anyone wanted to have a go with anthotypes, then I recommend trying that with the spinach. Because if you have really strong sunlight, it can expose in, you know, a matter of hours or less than an hours. When I been working with it in Portugal, I think we managed to get a print in an hour, which is like quite crazy for anthotypes, because if you've ever worked with them before, you know, sometimes you're sat there for months like waiting for anything to happen.
Yes. So you mean if we put a negative or object on pieces or leaves of spinach and leave them in the sun?
So the process of anthotype making, you would make an emulsion with your spinach. So you'd grind it down, and then you would squeeze out the liquid, so you don't have any lumps in there, and that's your emulsion. Essentially, it's just spinach juice. and then you can coat this on anything that will kind of absorb it. You know, I've had people coat it on like paper-based sculptures. It doesn't have to be, you know, flat. It can be 3D. And then you place objects, or you place a negative on this, and you put it out in the sun. And then you just wait for the areas around that object to bleach out. And if you want to use a photograph, or you don't want to print acetate, you can also print on just regular, like cheap printer paper, and then oil it. And the act of oiling it makes it more translucent, so that then the light can pass through those areas of paper that haven't had ink on them.
Fascinating. Nail polish. I'm just checking quickly if there are any questions already. Oh, I hear here Tulta say that people have used SCOBY for projecting screens, at least.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Someone in the group has used one.
I don't know. I never heard of it, but I thought maybe SCOBY could even be strong enough to run through a projector if it's.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I like want to move it towards. Because you can grow it to the desired thickness that you want. You know, you can just essentially you choose when you harvest it, and so therefore you choose the thickness that it's at and the kind of durability of it. And it's it can go quite brittle if it's quite thin and it gets really dry. But at the same time, if you just moisten it, then suddenly it's like incredibly malleable again. It's quite strong. You know, you could grow it into the formation of a film, because you can grow it to whatever shape container you have. And then you can coat it. So absolutely. And I think it would, you know, it could also sustain like going through a projector as well, much more than I think paper could.
It's a very interesting thought. But for tomorrow, for the ones who are going to be here in our lab working on it tomorrow, so we got this diazo sensitizer you were talking about from the silk screen printing industry. It came with an emulsion. That was the only option. They didn't sell it separate. I don't know what the emulsion is doing, but they say we have to put them together. Or
so the emulsion basically activates it. So with those ones, you just need to be aware that once the emulsion is in there, I think the solution only lasts like 30 hours or something like that, or like 1 or 2 days. So once it's mixed up, then just coat, like, you know, use it all basically within a day or two, because otherwise it hardens. And you can't use it. So it fixes itself. I guess it's a bit like if you're making a resin and you put the two bits together and then they harden, but a bit slower. So hopefully that will be good in terms of like hardening to your film or whatever surfaces you're working with. But yeah, don't mix it up like way ahead of time.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. That's a good. And so we have this diazo synthesizer with the emulsion, and I got UV lights, but from the secondhand markets, which is a face browner.
Okay, cool. That will work. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an old-fashioned way to get a 10.
Right.
According to what I found on the internet, this is specifically UVA.
Okay.
So it should be.
Not sure about the numbers, but
so 380
watts.
Yeah.
Cool.
So I mean in the light where it is.
Oh.
So it should be the good UV.
Okay.
I don't know how the weather will be tomorrow here. Today it was rainy.
Yeah. And someone actually asked about that, the UV light in the questions. Filter asked, can it be hardened under UV like screen printing? So yeah, absolutely. The diazo, in combination with the paint that you're going to use tomorrow, you'll then harden it with your objects or your negative, whatever it is that you're printing on your film under your UV light.
Mm-hmm. So there are many suggestions about the SCOBY. It seems that the SCOBY is very triggering a lot.
Well, if anyone wants to talk about their own experience with scobias, if other people have been working with it, I'm, very happy for people to unmute themselves and share.
The idea is that everything we're going to do in a couple of time, we are going to gather all the tryouts, but also what we did, that we write what we did really like a kind of scientific research, but on pseudo, of course. We will write everything down, and by the time we will also share everything. And Lichun is already putting the material list.
Great.
For what is needed and what you said. The idea behind this whole project is that everyone do try this at home, and it will be nice if more people will try out and then share everything as open access and everything. So I hope it will be. Lichun is putting some extra the material list.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone is interested to get this material list, just send us an email to filmwerkplaats@worm.org. I will provide all the information we already have. If there are no new questions, I just want to very much thank you, Hannah, for this inspiring lecture. And I also want to say that on Saturday, the 17th of July, we will have the next lecture, which will be given by me. It's all about the silver gelatin emulsion and how to do it yourself and how to coat this on 16, which as far as my experience is the hardest to do of everything. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope it will be a very inspiring time by trying this all out at home and here in the lab, and hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow here in Rotterdam in the lab. So if anyone wants to know more, just send an email to filmwerkplaats@worm.org. Thank you all. Thank you very much, Hannah, and hope to see you on the 17th all.
Yes, definitely. I would really like to come.
So bye for now.
Bye.